Happy Halloween, everyone! It's that time of year when everybody is feeling extra spooky and it's socially acceptable to eat your body weight in chocolate. Don't forget, chocolate will also be cheaper tomorrow. As an adult, especially one without kids that doesn't typically spend any time in bars or clubs, I always settle down to find my own ways to keep the spooky, scary skeleton inside of me satiated. It's never the same thing every year though. Sometimes I'll binge horror movies, other times I'll read a ton of creepypasta, or I might just feel like scaring myself half to death with a ton of video games. For those of you like me who don't really want to go out and do stuff, but you still want to enjoy the holiday spirit, I figured I'd put together a small list of suggestions across several mediums just to give you the most options. I will preface this list by saying that I'm not necessarily the most qualified to recommend spooky stuff, so if you're looking for hyper-obscure media, this probably isn't going to scratch that itch. This is more or less a small gathering of things I think some of you might not have been aware of, but aren't necessarily obscure to the degree of more dedicated horror YouTubers. Second, I want to say that while the theme of this list is very much Halloween, not everything on here is going to be strictly horror. Some of it is going to be slightly more lighthearted, or just downright ridiculous. That being said though, I don't believe this quality would take away from your overall enjoyment of the experience. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe for more content coming soon. If you're feeling so inclined, you can also support the channel by becoming a patron on Patreon for as little as $1 a month, which can net you some pretty neat things, as well as your name at the end of every video. Links to both Patreon and the channel's Discord are in the description below, along with timestamps. There won't be any heavy spoilers here, so don't worry, and let's get rolling. First up, we have some movies you can start your spooky season with, if that's your jam. Coming in first is a movie that kind of scarred me as a kid. Tales from the Hood is basically exactly what it sounds like on the surface. It follows three dudes from the hood that are told a collection of stories by a pretty intense mortician. This anthology film can be both incredibly unsettling, but also downright goofy, sometimes within the same scene. The biggest advantage of the film is the brevity of each story. If you're not particularly feeling one, it'll be over and on to the next before you realize it. If cheesy horror schlock with a touch of social commentary segmented into self-contained stories sounds like fun to you, check out Tales from the Hood. Vampire in Brooklyn is definitely one of the weirder ones on this list for one reason: Eddie Murphy. On one hand, it's ultra bizarre to see an actor known for his humor playing a serious antagonist with basically no redeemable qualities. Yet in the same vein, he's still allowed to get up to the same typical Eddie Murphy antics like playing multiple characters with larger-than-life personalities. Angela Bassett is the main character that handles the role pretty well despite the absurdity of the script. However, don't let what I've described fool you into dismissing this film. There are quite a bit of tense scenes to be had here, and while I did laugh a few times in places I doubt I was meant to, rewatching it was still an enjoyable and at times gripping viewing experience. The Bay is one of my favorite found footage films, and I know so many of you probably rolled your eyes at those words, and trust me, I get it. It was a genre that just suddenly existed one day and flooded the market. However, The Bay is done in a way that I found pretty refreshing. The story follows the demise of a town that's ended up with larger than normal cephalopods in its bay and water supply. I don't want to say too much because this is better experienced blind. It's not going to blow your mind or revolutionize how you see found footage, but the presentation and slow unraveling of information is what makes it such a cool and tragic experience for the unsuspecting town. Moving on to the next category, we've got video games. This is an area that I should have much more to say, but unfortunately I don't play a ton of indie horror games because of my schedule, and even if I did, so much of it has already been spotlighted by popular YouTubers, and I don't want to just parrot their talking points or bore you with stuff you've already watched people play to death. So I can only pull from my personal history of gaming to point you in the right direction. First up, we have the Zombies Ain't My Neighbors Doom 2 mod by Dude27th that takes the classic Super Nintendo game of the same name and transforms it from the top-down perspective to the iconic first-person perspective of the OG Doom franchise. For those of you who haven't played it, Zombies Ain't My Neighbors plops you in the shoes of either Zeke or Julie as they run around their town saving their neighbors from the Walking Dead using squirt guns, fire extinguishers, weed whackers, tomatoes, even plates and cutlery. The levels are completely rebuilt using incredibly well-placed assets mirroring the look of the original game with even the same map layouts. It's crazy just how different of an experience this game is when you're playing in first person, not to mention just how much easier it is to get jump scared by zombies or filled with dread at the sight of a chainsaw guy in the hedge maze. But what really adds the icing to the cake is the remixed music. I'm a huge fan of the original soundtrack, but the band Lame Genie did an absolutely killer cover of every song on the tracklist. If you've ever played the original Zombies Ate My Neighbors, you owe it to yourself to pick up this fantastic mod. Hell, even if you've never once played the SNES title, give this a try. I'll be leaving a link to the mod page as well as the Lame Genie soundtrack in the description. Switching gears from the pixelated horror of your local suburban neighborhood, we have the multiplayer indie game Devour. Essentially, you and 3 players go into a building, gather materials, and carry out what I can only assume is supposed to be an exorcism. There's actually some narrative threads you can follow too, but honestly, once the panic sets in, the last thing on your mind will be the lore. Devour can be a bit challenging to get into the swing of, especially when you're brand new to the game, but I think this particular experience for me was more about hearing my friends panicking as things got increasingly spookier and the monster got much more aggressive. It's typically pretty cheap on Steam, so if you're feeling like making your friends suffer with you, this might be good for a night of screams or even a creative drinking game. Galerians is one of the earliest quote-unquote Resident Evil clones I ever got my hands on, but instead of paying homage to classic horror, it leans more heavily towards sci-fi with some Skynet vibes sprinkled throughout. You follow the journey of Rion, an angsty teenage boy who wakes up in the lab and realizes he's got psychic powers. Now he's got to figure out what the hell is going on while trying to fight off others with powers like his own that are hunting him, as well as keeping his powers in check so that they don't completely fry his brain and tear him apart. If you appreciate the stifling atmospheres and the sense of dread from the early Resident Evil titles, along with several other gameplay mechanics like fixed camera angles and tank controls, you might really enjoy Galerians. It's got an honestly fantastic story that culminates in an exciting finale. The psychic powers are fun to toy with, the antagonists are all memorable and tragic in their own ways, and the tone is just perfect. It's got its hiccups, but those are overall eroded by the positives. If you've got a PlayStation 1, get your hands on it. If you don't have one or don't want to buy Galerians, there are other ways to play it, but I'll let you figure that out. If none of those tickle your fancy, or you're looking for something to scratch the itch of a good visual read, I've got 3 graphic novels / webtoons that might have flown under your radar but are worth the time it takes to pour through them. As with everything else I'm able to, links to each of these will be provided in the video description. Probably the most twisted one in this category is God's Left Hand, Devil's Right Hand by Umezo Kazuo. This manga spans 77 chapters and follows the incredibly unlucky misadventures of a young boy named So as he's pitted up against some absolutely nightmare scenarios one after the other. So has the ability to foresee supernatural events in his dreams, and to a degree can even make changes to said dreams that eventually have real-world consequences. Even just knowing that important information, I don't think you're prepared for the complete lunacy this poor kid gets subjected to. The art style is visceral in all the ways it needs to be, not shying away from horrifying or gruesome imagery to spare anyone's feelings. So if explicit violence and body horror make you queasy, you might want to stay far away from this one. However, if you're a fan of that kind of extreme physical horror popularized by Junji Ito, God's Left Hand, Devil's Right Hand is a must-read for you. The first of 2 webtoons in this category, Gremoryland weaves the tale of a brutal amusement park hidden away from prying eyes that ensnares a couple of groups of deeply unfortunate teenagers. It gives off similar vibes to the One Day at Horrorland story from the Goosebumps series, but with far more dangerous attractions and terrible consequences for the trapped groups of friends. The biggest draw of the story is the mystery behind the hellish theme park itself, as well as the secrets and drama that slowly come to light amongst the group that leads them to distrust, suspect, and even turn on each other in some cases. The dialogue can feel kind of stilted from the lack of the use of contractions, and some of the characterization can certainly feel lacking at times, but I don't think those 2 nitpicks are enough to tank the experience as a whole. The series has recently wrapped, so you can just binge it from start to finish. If you're not as keen on something as intense as God's Left Hand, Gremoryland might be more your speed. Paranatural is a supernatural action comedy written by Zach Morrison following the goofy adventures of Max after he and his family moved to the strange town of Mayview. On his first night in his new home, amusingly located above a convenience store, and even during his first day of school, Max starts to realize that he can see people and creatures that his peers can't. It isn't long before another of the main characters, Isaac, notices that Max might be just like him, and eventually Max ends up a member of the Paranatural Activity Club, basically a bunch of junior Ghostbusters. I cannot overstate just how funny this comic is. It is absolutely oozing with personality, charm, and wit. While you'll come to enjoy the action-adventure aspect of the group's journey, at its core it is first and foremost a comedy without detracting from the more serious moments. Just rereading it for this video had me cracking up like crazy, and I'm positive you'll get the same enjoyment. If you're not looking to lose sleep but still want to check out something that has a Halloween vibe to it, Paranatural is the easiest choice to make on this entire list. On to the next category, I want to talk about a pair of anime. So I'm only going to mention 2 here because even though I watched a handful to prepare for this list, a couple of them didn't really fit the theme of this video once I finished them. One I didn't have time to get to, so I'll have to watch that on my own time, and 2 of them are getting their own dedicated videos in the future, and I didn't want to pad out this list with just some nonsense recommendation. First up is an anime that took me by surprise, a little title called Shiki. Shiki follows the mysterious deaths of the residents of a rural mountain town. We follow a school kid named Natsu and a doctor named Toshio who work to unravel the strange deaths happening to their peers and friends. That's genuinely all I can say without diving into spoiler territory, so I'll switch gears a bit. Shiki effortlessly nails the tone and places you smack in the middle of an impressive atmosphere where everyone knows on some level that something is terribly wrong, but no one wants to talk about it too seriously. The violence and gore, while present at times, is exceedingly rare. The story is more designed to allow a creeping sense of dread to fill your bones than it is to shock you. The art style is very angular, kind of like Yu-Gi-Oh!, but I stopped noticing that after a while. The musical choices do a masterful job of creating dramatic tension without overstaying its welcome. Lastly, I will have to warn you that the show starts off rather slow. The story doesn't actually start getting interesting until about episode 5 or 6, but once it sinks its teeth in, you're good to go. I totally get if that's too many episodes to wait for the intrigue to come online, because the first time I attempted to watch Shiki was around April. I forced myself to finish it for this video, and once I made it past that initial slump, I was glad that I continued. Give it a try if you're curious, but I'll understand if you pass. My next recommendation is a bit more basic, but only because I legitimately hadn't seen it until a couple of weeks back when I began working on this list. The horror anime Another was kind of a strange experience for me because of just how popular it is within the genre. Up until recently, the only thing I knew about this show was that a girl falls down some stairs and impales herself on an umbrella. That one clip has been floating around for years, so I finally wanted to check it out. Honestly, this show wasn't nearly as violent or screwed up as I was anticipating it to be. There's a tremendous amount of downtime where we have concepts or events explained to us, some of which comes fast and furious. The easiest comparison I can make would be to that of the Final Destination franchise, so when things go wrong for the cast, they go very wrong. It's never objectively scary, but just like Final Destination, it has an excruciating way of building tension in that uneasy, car crash in a slow motion kind of way. Like, you can see the pieces falling into place and that only makes the feeling worse. Though I think the best thing about this show is how it just completely goes off the rails in the last 2 episodes. It doesn't even feel like the same show during the finale. This is a fun watch if you're not looking for something to upend your current understanding of anime horror. It's cheesy fun with the occasional bit of violence culminating in a very bizarre ending that does admittedly have an entertaining payoff. For our last category, I want to briefly touch on some actual reading material for those who are feeling a bit more analog this spooky season. Considering the nature of this medium, I really won't be able to tell you too much aside from the general premise and my thoughts. Regardless, all 3 of these stories are absolute must-reads for their own reasons, as we'll get into. First up on the chopping block is probably my favorite creepypasta collection, Search and Rescue. As the title suggests, this series of posts follows an unnamed search and rescue worker who relays some of their experiences as well as the experiences of their co-workers on the job. The story is designed as though the protagonist is talking directly to the audience, kind of like they were addressing comments from a Q&A, which gives the series a more personal and intimate feel. These stories chronicle some of the various horrors that these workers have lived to tell about while searching for missing persons, as well as one of the more enigmatic objects in the world of creepypastas, the staircases in the forests. These staircases don't lead anywhere, come in all shapes and sizes and conditions, and the protagonist makes several comments about how their colleagues, and especially the higher-ups, refuse to talk about the stairs and explicitly forbid anyone from approaching or climbing them. Each entry of the story comes with a different, unconnected tale of terror, but what binds them all together are the repeated appearances of these stairs. Search and Rescue is a fairly long read, but holy hell is it worth it. This story in particular even went on to be adapted into the Butcher's Block story arc of the show Channel Zero, but trust me, you are much better just reading the source material. The Holders is an interesting collection that lends itself to both imagination as well as reading at your own pace. Basically, you as the reader take on the role of the seeker. As the story goes, in any country, in any city, you can go to any mental institution or halfway house and ask to see one of the Holders. Each holder has its own domain name that you'd ask the front receptionist to speak to, such as the Holder of Ambition, the Holder of Nothing, the Holder of Sleep, and so on. Each holder guards one object of power that has supernatural properties it can bestow upon whomever is in possession of it. While plenty of these objects have properties that can be endlessly useful or ridiculously beneficial, there are just as many that are destructive or just downright detrimental or dangerous. In total, there are 2,538 objects in the canonical universe of the holders. 2,000 of them have been lost to time completely, leaving just the 538 the stories are built around. Each holder gets its own story explaining the soul-shredding, life or death trial you as the Seeker would undertake in order to obtain their corresponding object, and it doesn't pull its punches in describing just how screwed you'd be if you failed at any point during your trial, no matter how small the mistake is. The basic premise of the series is that the remaining 538 objects must never be brought together under any circumstances, and it's left up to the whims of the Seeker whether they will prevent an unnamed cataclysm from occurring and further separate the objects, or if they will bring those untold horrors to fruition by bringing the objects together at last. The coolest thing about the Holder series is that it's just like the entries of the SCP Foundation. It was a community story, so different people contributed different holders to the final list. This difference in style adds another layer of separation between the objects and their holders, making it feel pretty meta in that regard. The original website for the holders has vanished, but I did manage to find an archive on a different website that has quite a few of these entries on one page. It isn't ideal, and from what I could tell, it also isn't a comprehensive list, but it is one of the only remaining ways to check out this incredible series. Last, but certainly not least, we come to the existential sci-fi nightmare that is I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream by Harlan Ellison. This famous short story published way back in 1967 chronicles the tyrannical reign of the sentient computer Am, decades and decades after it has obliterated the world and effectively driven all but a handful of humans to extinction. Am uses its vast intellect to keep this one group of humans alive indefinitely, subjecting them to all kinds of torturous experiments and hellish trials for its entertainment, as well as to serve as the object of its hatred for humanity. The kinds of torment this malevolent supercomputer forces the group to endure honestly left me speechless the first time I read this years ago. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream really takes the extreme approach in warning about the inherent dangers of humans building systems that could easily outclass us to such a degree that it leads to our own destruction. You know, kind of like those people nowadays that offer grim warnings about the technological singularity and how dangerously close we're getting to that line in our unending quest to optimize our own lives. It's unapologetic in its tone, showing the reader just how powerless we'd truly be against the very machines we devised to make the world better should we ever tiptoe past the point of no return. I used to think the Terminator universe was the worst possible future for mankind in terms of technology, but this nightmarish existence with Am at the helm and the total absence of death to put an end to your unyielding suffering makes Skynet look like the backyardigans. If you want to fill yourself with a very relevant kind of dread and side-eye all of your appliances for the next week, you have to read I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. Well, that about wraps it up for the recommendations list. I hope there were some things on here that you hadn't heard of that you might be interested in sifting through yourself now. As I said earlier, links to all of the things that I can link will be floating around in the description below. If you have any Halloween recommendations you'd like to share, feel free to chat it out in the comments or drop by the Discord. I do want to give a very special thanks to Zoran for being my first patron on Patreon. Much love to you, dude. And if you'd like to have your name plastered up in my videos alongside Zoran's, consider hopping over to the Somewhere Past Neighbor Patreon page where you can support the channel for as little as $1 a month. I'll be looking forward to seeing what you guys recommend in the comments. Be safe and have fun out there this Halloween, take care of yourselves and others, and as always, thanks for watching.